What a samurai versus Mongol battle really looked like. Before dawn broke over Hakata Bay on the 19th of November, 1274, the sea itself seemed to hold its breath. The fishermen who had lived along that curved coastline of northern Kyushu their entire lives had never seen anything like it. In the gray pre-light, where the horizon normally offered only open water and had the distant silhouette of Shikanoshima Island, there was something else. Something massive. Something that did not belong to the world they knew. Ships. Hundreds upon hundreds of ships, riding at anchors so close together that a man might almost walk from hull to hull without wetting his feet. Their masts rose from the mist like a leafless forest transplanted from some foreign nightmare, dense, black, and absolutely silent in the still autumn air. There were 900 of them. On the shore, a Japanese scout pressed his sandaled feet into the damp sand and stared. He had been sent to watch for this. He had been warned it was coming. But no warning in the world, no messenger's breathless report, no imperial decree read aloud in a greatly hall could have prepared him for the sheer physical reality of what floated before him now. He turned and ran. What he carried back toward the samurai camps was not just information. It was a verdict. The Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire the world had ever seen, the machine that had erased the Jin dynasty of northern China, crushed the Abbasid Caliphate of Baghdad, shattered the armies of Poland and Hungary in a single campaigning season, and reduced the Song dynasty of southern China to its final desperate gasp, had arrived. And it had not come to negotiate. On those 900 ships rode approximately 30,000 soldiers, Mongol cavalry of terrifying battlefield efficiency, Chinese infantry seasoned by decades of the Khan's continental wars, and Korean sailors and soldiers dragooned into service by an empire that knew how to conscript entire nations. They carried weapons that Japan had never faced, explosive bombs filled with gunpowder and iron shrapnel, poisoned arrows launched from powerful composite bows, and a tactical doctrine built not on individual glory, but on coordinated, disciplined, industrial slaughter. The samurai waiting on that shore numbered perhaps 6,000 to 10,000 men at most. The contrast was not merely numerical. It was civilizational. Two entirely different philosophies of war were about to collide on this narrow stretch of sand, and only one of them had ever failed before. Japan had refused to kneel. 3 times Kublai Khan had sent ambassadors demanding submission and tribute. 3 times the Japanese court had deliberated and delayed. But each delay was interpreted not as caution in Kublai's court. It was interpreted as contempt. And finally, fatally some would say, the regent Hojo Tokimune had ordered the last Mongol ambassador executed. The message could not have been clearer if it had been written in fire across the sky. This was the Khan's answer. But the samurai on that shore did not know the full size of what was coming. They had heard rumors, numbers passed from one courier to the next, growing with each telling. But rumors and the physical reality of 900 ships are entirely different categories of knowledge. By the time the sun had fully risen on that November morning, the world as the samurai knew it, their rituals, their rules, their entire code of honorable combat, was about to be tested against something it had never been designed to fight. Not a rival clan, not a neighboring lord. Something from beyond the edge of the known world, armed with the weapons of a dozen conquered civilizations, and absolutely indifferent to the beauty of a single warrior's death. This battle would not just decide the fate of Japan. It would create a legend that endured for 7 centuries and change the very meaning of what it meant to be Japanese forever. To understand why 30,000 soldiers from the Eurasian heartland were floating off the coast of a Japanese island in the autumn of 1274, you have to understand what the Mongol Empire was. Not the cartoon version, not the simplified story of horse-riding barbarians who got lucky. The real thing. And the real thing was something so methodically, almost mechanically terrifying that even 1,000 years later, historians struggle to find adequate comparisons. Genghis Khan had unified the nomadic tribes of the Mongolian steppe by 1206. Within 20 years, his armies had reached the Pacific in the east and the Caspian Sea in the west. When Genghis died in 1227, his sons and grandsons did not slow down. They accelerated. By 1241, Mongol forces had crushed the combined armies of Poland and Hungary simultaneously, in 2 separate theaters separated by hundreds of miles, within 2 days of each other. The Duke of Silesia died at the Battle of Legnica. King Bela IV of Hungary barely escaped drowning in the Adriatic Sea. Only the death of the great Khan Ogedei in Mongolia halted the Western advance, forcing the commanders to return home for the election of a successor. Europe had no idea how close it had come to disappearing. By the time Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, formally proclaimed the Yuan dynasty in 1271 and moved his capital to what is now Beijing, the Mongol Empire stretched from Korea to Poland, from Siberia to the Persian Gulf. It was not merely an empire. It was a system, a machine for the conversion of resistance into submission, of independent kingdoms into tax-paying provinces, of living cultures into footnotes. Kublai himself was, in many ways, different from his ancestors. He was more cosmopolitan, more interested in administration and trade than in the pure thrill of conquest. He employed Chinese bureaucrats, patronized Buddhist monks, hosted Marco Polo at his court. But the engine of expansion he had inherited did not know how to stop. And there was one neighbor that had refused, repeatedly and insultingly, to acknowledge the reality that the world had changed. Japan. To understand Japan's refusal, you must understand what Japan was in 1274, and specifically, what it was not. It was not a unified state in any modern sense. The emperor still sat in Kyoto, performing sacred rituals, issuing edicts, maintaining the divine fiction of imperial rule. But real power had shifted more than 70 years earlier to the shogunate, the military government. And within the shogunate, actual control rested with the Hojo clan, who served as regents to a figurehead shogun. The regent in 1274 was Hojo Tokimune, 18 years old when he took power, and possessed of a quality that either made him a hero or a catastrophic fool, depending on your vantage point. Absolute, unshakable nerve. The Mongol ambassadors had arrived in 1268, bearing Kublai's letter. The language of that letter was careful, diplomatic on the surface, but unmistakably clear in its meaning. Japan was invited to become a tributary state. The alternative was left implied rather than stated, though anyone who had read the history of what happened to kingdoms that refused such invitations understood perfectly what the implication contained. The Japanese court deliberated. They sent no reply. The Khan sent more ambassadors. Still no reply. A third embassy arrived in 1271. The court discussed the matter at extraordinary length. They consulted priests, astrologers, and senior nobles. They conducted purification ceremonies. They worried, debated, stalled. Tokimune did not stall. He acted. He had the final ambassadors escorted to Hakata, the city closest to Korea across the Korea Strait, and there, on the beach, had them beheaded. It was an act of deliberate, almost theatrical defiance, and it meant war. But who would fight it? Japan's military system was organized around the samurai, the warrior class that had evolved over centuries from provincial guards into a fully developed aristocratic fighting culture with its own aesthetics, its own spiritual practices, its own elaborate code of conduct. Samurai warfare as it had developed through Japan's internal conflicts, the clan wars, the Genpei War of the late 12th century, the various shogunal disputes, was in many ways a highly ritualized affair. Challenges were issued, genealogies were announced before combat. Individual duels between named champions were considered the highest expression of martial virtue. A warrior sought not merely victory, but a beautiful death, a death witnessed and remembered, a death that would be spoken of by future generations. The Mongols had never heard of this system, and even if they had, it would not have mattered to them in the slightest. The commander appointed to lead the invasion was a man named Kim Bang-gyong, a Korean general pressed into service as an experienced navigator of the waters between Korea and Japan. Alongside him was Liu Fuyuan, a Chinese general commanding the infantry elements of the force, and Holdon, a Mongol general responsible for the elite cavalry and overall strategic command. These three men represented the composite nature of the Yuan army perfectly. Mongol tactical genius at the top, Chinese administrative and infantry expertise in the middle, Korean maritime knowledge as the operational foundation. They had studied Japan. They had Korean advisors who understood the terrain, the currents, the likely landing points. They knew that Hakata Bay, on the northern coast of Kyushu, the southwesternmost of Japan's main islands, offered the best conditions for a large-scale amphibious landing. A wide, relatively shallow bay with room enough to maneuver 900 ships and put tens of thousands of troops ashore in organized waves. They had also studied, to whatever extent they could, the warriors who would meet them. What they found must have been, from a purely tactical standpoint, both reassuring and curious. The samurai were individually formidable, perhaps the finest one-on-one swordsmen in the world. Their armor, the iconic lamellar construction of lacquered iron and leather scales laced together with silk cord, was beautiful and functional. designed to distribute the impact of arrows and blades. Their bows, the asymmetrical Japanese longbow known as the yumi, were powerful, accurate weapons capable of launching heavy arrows at tremendous range. Their swords, the products of a forging tradition centuries in development, were technological marvels. But they fought as individuals. They announced themselves. They sought duels. They had no coordinated tactical doctrine for responding to massed, disciplined infantry formations advancing under a coordinated arrow barrage, followed by explosive projectiles that had never been seen on Japanese soil before. What the Mongols were bringing to Hakata Bay was not merely a larger army. It was an entirely different theory of war. And somewhere on that dark shoreline, among the pine trees and the watching cranes and the fishermen's boats hauled above the tide line, the samurai were preparing to answer it with everything they had, which was courage, skill, and a set of rules that the enemy had no intention of following. The Bay of Hakata curves like a crescent moon along the northern coast of Kyushu, cradling a stretch of shoreline that in 1274 was bordered by low dunes, scrub pine, and the beginning of the flat agricultural plain that spread inland toward the town of Dazaifu, the ancient administrative capital of the island. The water was shallow near the shore, shallow enough that horses could wade in from landing craft, and the beach itself was wide and firm, the kind of ground that allowed rapid movement of large formations once troops were ashore. It was, in short, ideal landing country. The Japanese commanders understood this. They had known since the first Mongol embassy that if an invasion came, it would come here, at Hakata, at the closest point between Kyushu and the Korean peninsula, separated only by 112 miles of open sea across the Korea Strait. The crossing was dangerous in autumn, when storms could rise without warning, but it was navigable. And the Mongols, with their Korean sailors, knew how to navigate it. The Japanese response to the threat had been partially mobilized before the fleet ever left Korean shores. Kyushu's warrior clans, the Otomo, the Shoni, the Kikuchi, and dozens of smaller houses, had been called to muster under the overall command of the Shoni clan's lord, Shoni Tsunesuke. Defensive earthworks had been discussed, though the construction of a substantial stone wall along the Hakata shoreline, the famous Genko Borui, the Mongol defense wall, would not actually be completed until after this first invasion, in preparation for the second. In 1274, the Japanese defenders had to work with the terrain as it was: the beach, the dunes, the shallow water, and the rice paddies and wooded hills that lay behind. The samurai who gathered at Hakata were the finest warriors Japan had produced. Many were veterans of Japan's internal conflicts, men who had fought in clan disputes, who had trained since childhood in the bow, the sword, and horsemanship. They came mounted, their horses the small, sturdy breed suited to Japan's terrain rather than the open steppe, and they came with their retainers, the foot soldiers who served beneath the mounted warriors, armed with spears, bows, and the shorter blades suited to infantry work. But they came, most critically, without a doctrine for the kind of war that was about to be waged against them. They had tactics for fighting other samurai. They had none for fighting an empire. A samurai of the Kamakura period dressed for battle in layers that told the story of centuries of development. The foundation was a heavy linen underrobe, followed by a padded jacket that cushioned the impact of blows. Over this came the armor itself, the o yoroi, the grat armor, worn by the highest-ranking mounted warriors, a construction that used hundreds of small iron and leather scales, lacquered against rust and moisture, laced together with colored silk cord in patterns that identified clan and rank at a glance. The helmet, the kabuto, was a marvel of ironwork. Its flared neck guard, the shikoro, designed to deflect downward sword cuts, its prominent crest identifying the wearer as a man of consequence. The entire assembly could weigh upward of 30 pounds. In it, a samurai was a walking fortress. The weapons he carried were extensions of identity as much as instruments of war. The yumi, the Japanese asymmetrical longbow, was the primary weapon of mounted samurai combat. A composite bow of extraordinary power, its unusual asymmetry designed so that it could be drawn from horseback without the upper limb striking the horse's neck. Samurai trained for years simply in the art of drawing this bow while moving at speed, a skill called yabusame when performed ceremonially. The arrows were heavy, with a distinctive low whistle as they flew, a sound the samurai called kaburaya when the whistling warhead was attached, a sound meant to announce the opening of individual combat. At their hip rode the tachi, a curved blade longer and more slender than the later katana of popular imagination, designed for drawing and cutting from horseback in a single fluid motion. And at close quarters, there was the shorter sword, the ko-katana, and for the final desperate moments of hand-to-hand fighting, the dagger, the tanto, pressed against armor gaps with intimate, surgical violence. They were extraordinary. Against any enemy they had previously faced, any Japanese enemy, they would have been unstoppable. But the night before the battle, in the flickering light of watchfires along the dune line, some of the older warriors had heard things from refugees fleeing from the landing points on Tsushima and Iki Islands, the two island stepping stones the Mongol fleet had struck first, before sailing for Kyushu. What they heard was not reassuring. On Tsushima, the defending samurai had ridden down to the beach to meet the invaders in the traditional manner. The lord of Tsushima, So Sukekuni, had reportedly mustered 80 mounted warriors and charged the landing force. 80 against thousands. The charge had been magnificent, but the enemy had not been impressed by its magnificence, and it had been utterly destroyed, not by samurai to samurai combat, but by volleys of arrows so dense they darkened the air, followed by the explosion of objects that weren't arrows at all, that burst upon impact with a sound like thunder and scattered iron fragments in every direction. The survivors from Tsushima spoke of soldiers who did not stop to identify themselves, who did not call out their names and lineage, who simply advanced in formations, shield to shield, and killed everything in front of them with mechanical, terrifying efficiency. Somewhere in the samurai camps that night, men sharpened blades that were already sharp, and checked bowstrings that were already perfect. Grooms checked and rechecked the bindings on horses that had no experience of what gunpowder smelled like when it exploded. Samurai who had been trained from birth to seek a glorious death in individual combat sat in silence with that training and tried to make it fit a situation it had never been designed for. But training and reality have a way of separating in the night before battle, and no amount of willpower can close the distance between what you have prepared for and what you are about to face. Some prayed. The temples of Hakata, particularly the great Hakozaki shrine, dedicated to the deity of the sea, had been filled with priests performing purification rites for weeks. The local monks had prayed to Hachiman, the god of war, and to the gods of wind and wave. Perhaps the gods were listening. Perhaps they were busy. No one on that beach in the darkness before dawn knew. What they knew was what was coming. And in the cold pre-dawn air, with the torches of the Mongol fleet reflected in broken fragments on the black water of the bay, the samurai of Kyushu prepared to do what samurai were trained to do. They prepared to die well. The commanders, Shoni Tsunesuke, Otomo Yoriyasu, Kikuchi Takefusa, and the dozens of lesser lords beneath them, had done what they could. They had positioned their forces along the shore and on the landward approaches. They had posted scouts on the beach and riders to carry messages. They had discussed, in the war councils of the previous days, how to respond to the threat. The consensus was not sophisticated. It was samurai consensus. When the enemy comes, ride out and meet him. There was no contingency plan for explosives. There was no doctrine for responding to massed archery delivered not as individual duels, but as coordinated suppressive fire from formations of hundreds. There was no answer in the samurai's training for an enemy who had no interest in your name, your lineage, or the glory of your individual combat record. There was only the shore, and the ships, and the sound of 30,000 men beginning to move. Phase 1. The Landing. Dawn broke over Hakata Bay in shades of gray and copper, and with it came the sound. It began as a deep, rhythmic percussion, the drumbeat of 1,000 drums aboard 900 ships, carrying across the water with a resonance that the samurai on the shore felt in their chests before they heard it in their ears. Then came the horns, long, low, mournful brass tones that had carried Mongol armies across the Asian continent. that had preceded the fall of Beijing and Baghdad and Krakow, that now rolled across the morning water of a Japanese bay like the voice of some enormous, indifferent machine announcing its arrival. The samurai horses heard it too. They shifted and stamped, their breath misting in the cold morning air. Their riders held them still, barely. The landing crafts, flat-bottomed vessels that the Mongol fleet carried in the bellies of their larger ships, specifically for amphibious operations, were already being lowered. From the shore, they looked like beetles emerging from a carcass, dozens of them simultaneously, spreading across the gray water in organized columns. In each craft, soldiers stood in tight ranks. Mongol cavalry with their horses, Chinese infantry with spears and crossbows, Korean archers. They moved with the mechanical precision of men who had done this before, in other bays, on other shores, against other peoples who had also believed themselves impossible to conquer. Shoni Tsunesuke watched from horseback at the center of the Japanese line. He was a veteran warrior, a man who had spent his life in the service of the Kyushu military administration. He understood tactics. He understood horses and swords and the choreography of the kind of warfare Japan had been conducting for centuries. What was spreading toward him across the water of Hakata Bay was not that kind of warfare. But a samurai does not wait. A samurai moves. The signal was given. The mounted warriors of the leading Japanese contingent urged their horses forward, down the sloping beach and into the shallows, their battle banners snapping in the morning wind, their war cries building from scattered individual shouts into a single roaring wave of sound. It was magnificent. It was the response that centuries of warrior culture had designed, swift, aggressive, individual, proud. The first Mongol landing craft were still 40 yards from shore when the Japanese riders hit the water. And then the drums changed. What happened next would be described in the Japanese chronicles that recorded the invasion with a vocabulary that barely existed before that morning. The Mongol archers in the landing craft, not individual challengers stepping forward, but entire formations, hundreds of bows drawing simultaneously at a single command, unleashed the first coordinated volley. The arrows did not whistle with kabutoya warheads. They simply flew, faster and more numerous than anything the samurai had experienced, landing in the water around the charging horses and among the riders with a sound like rain on stone. Horses screamed, riders fell. But it was what came next that broke something fundamental in the morning. From positions at the bow of several landing craft, soldiers in padded jackets touched fire to ceramic pots. The tetsuhau, iron bomb grenades packed with gunpowder, iron fragments, and, in some accounts, poison. The pots arced through the gray air in short, tumbling trajectories. They landed, and the world exploded. The sound was unlike anything in the Japanese experience. A crack of compressed air and shattering ceramic, a pulse of heat visible as a brief orange flower, a scatter of iron fragments that hummed through the air at lethal velocity. The horses, which had never heard or smelled gunpowder before, went berserk. Several threw their riders instantly. Others reversed course, plowing back through the following samurai with blind, terrified force. The advance that had begun so powerfully, with such precision and courage, dissolved into chaos in the shallow water 20 yards from the enemy's boats. And boats. And the landing craft kept coming. Phase 2. The shore is lost. By mid-morning, the Mongols were ashore. Not all of them. The landing was still ongoing, the fleet still disgorging its cargo of soldiers. But enough. The first waves of Chinese infantry, protected by their rectangular shields and advancing in the close formation tactics that Liu Fuyuan's experience demanded, established a beachhead at the eastern end of the bay. The Japanese counterattacks were fierce, and they were individual, and they accomplished nothing against a formation that simply locked shields and advanced regardless of what struck it. One formation was pierced by a samurai charge, but it closed around the charging horses like water around a thrown stone, absorbing the impact, contracting, and moving forward again without breaking step. A samurai named Takazaki Suenaga, one of the few men whose personal account of the battle has survived, preserved because he commissioned a painted scroll depicting his actions, rode 3 separate charges into the Mongol formations that morning. In his account, he records the experience with a kind of stunned honesty. The arrows were different, heavier, able to pierce Japanese armor in ways that Japanese arrows could not. The soldiers he rode at did not scatter, did not back away, did not issue challenges or announce their names. They simply presented their weapons and held their ground, and when Takazaki's horse was hit and went down, the formation simply flowed around the fallen animal and continued forward. He survived. Many of his companions did not. But here was the truth that Takazaki's courage revealed, even as it illuminated his army's crisis. The Japanese could fight. The samurai were not outmatched in individual bravery, not broken in spirit. Every time a gap opened in the Mongol lines, there were Japanese warriors there to exploit it. Every Mongol soldier who became separated from his formation discovered very quickly that a samurai with a sword in open ground was a death sentence. The problem was not the quality of the warriors. The problem was the system. The Mongol tactical doctrine was built around suppression, formation integrity, and combined arms. The coordination of archers, infantry, and cavalry in sequences designed to exhaust and disorganize the enemy before delivering the decisive blow. Against a force that fought in coherent units, this required careful execution. Against a force of individual warriors, each fighting their own battle according to their own code, it was devastatingly efficient. Every individual samurai charge that the Mongol archers broke was one fewer coherent formation the Japanese could field. Every death created a gap in the defensive line. Every gap allowed more landing craft to come ashore. The Mongol cavalry came off the ships in the second and third waves, once the infantry had secured enough beach to allow horses to land without swimming. These were not the small, sturdy Japanese horses accustomed to forest paths and rice paddy roads. These were the short, barrel-chested steppe horses of the Mongolian grasslands, bred for endurance and responsiveness, trained to carry an archer who could release 3 aimed arrows in the time it took a European knight to cover 30 yards at full gallop. Mounted Mongol archers had destroyed armies that outnumbered them 3-1 on the open steppes of Central Asia. On the hard-packed sand of Hakata Beach, with room to wheel and fire and wheel again, they were a different species of danger than anything the samurai had trained for. But the Japanese did not break. They burned. They fell back, bleeding from a dozen wounds apiece, but they kept fighting. A warrior from the Otomo clan planted his banner in the sand at the dune line and refused to retreat another step, and 3 of his retainers died beside him before the position became untenable, and then his family's name was added to the list of the honored dead that the Kamakura bureaucrats would debate rewarding for the next decade. The beach was contested, meter by bloody meter, but the numbers were always wrong, and by mid-morning the numbers made themselves felt. By noon, the beach was lost. The Japanese had been pushed back from the water line to the dune line, and from the dune line into the scrub pine at the edge of the flat agricultural plain beyond. They were not routing, not yet, but they were giving ground, and in warfare, giving ground is a logic with its own terrible momentum. The Mongols consolidated. They brought up more soldiers, more horses, more of the ceramic bombs that had turned the opening charge to chaos. They set up their command positions on the beach, in the open, with a confidence that spoke to their certainty about how this day would end. Phase 3. The fight. Fight in the fields. The battle moved inland. In the flat rice paddies and narrow paths between the scrub pine stands behind the Hakata dunes, the nature of the fighting changed again. The open beach had favored the Mongol formation tactics and their coordinated archery. But the broken terrain of the coastal plain, intersected by irrigation channels, dotted with small shrines, broken by stands of trees, favored the individual ferocity and superior close combat skills of the samurai. Here, among the pine roots and the muddy paddies, a samurai warrior, with a good sword and the will to use it, was something the Mongol infantry genuinely feared. And the samurai used it. Kikuchi Takefusa, lord of the Kikuchi clan, whose family would be remembered in Japanese history as among the fiercest defenders of that day, led his retainers in a series of ambushes along the tree-lined approaches to the plain. They would wait in the shadow of the pines until a Mongol column passed, then hit the column from both sides simultaneously, cutting it to pieces before withdrawing before the inevitable counter-response could be organized. It was not glorious combat. It was not the kind of thing that ended up in formal chronicles. But it killed Mongol soldiers, and more importantly, it slowed the advance, complicated the logistics of expanding the beachhead, and bought time. Time for what? No one was entirely sure. The battle in the fields was savage and sustained. The tetsuhau grenades were less effective here, harder to aim accurately through trees, dangerous to use where Mongol and Japanese soldiers were intermixed in close combat. The Mongol cavalry, magnificent on open ground, found the muddy paddies and the root-strewn pine groves treacherous footing. Horses went lame. Formations became confused. Individual Mongol soldiers who had been trained to fight in units found themselves in the sudden close quarters of the tree lines, facing opponents who had trained their entire lives for exactly this. Intimate, brutal, one-on-one violence conducted at the range where a man can see the eyes of the person trying to kill him. The samurai were better at that. Undeniably, absolutely better. But the numbers were wrong. They had always been wrong. For every Mongol soldier killed in the pines, 2 more were coming ashore at Hakata Beach. The 30,000 were not all deployed yet. The landing was still ongoing through the afternoon, and each hour brought more soldiers, more arrows, more of the terrible exploding pots onto Japanese soil. The rice paddies themselves became killing grounds. A samurai dismounted to fight in the mud lost the mobility that was his greatest advantage. But the soft earth also swallowed the hooves of Mongol cavalry horses and broke the perfect alignment of infantry formations. Soldiers from both armies fell into irrigation channels and drowned under the weight of their armor. Men who had been fighting for hours, without food, with wounds bound in strips torn from their own clothing, found themselves standing knee-deep in muddy water, fighting men they could not communicate with, killing and being killed in conditions that stripped away all ceremony and left only the oldest, simplest question of all. Are you still alive? Yes, still alive. Keep going. A warrior from the Shoni retinue, whose name the chronicles did not think worth recording, fought through 3 separate engagements that afternoon. First at the dune line, then in the pine stand, then in the paddies behind the shrine of the local harvest deity, and survived all 3. We know this only because he appears as a background figure in Takazaki's scroll, identifiable by a distinctive pattern of damage to his armor's shoulder guards. He is shown, in the final panel, still standing, still watching the Mongol formations consolidate on the ground they have taken. He has no expression that the painter could capture, or perhaps dared to render. He is simply there, alive in a way that is indistinguishable from exhausted, but still there. Shoni Tsunesuke, watching his battle from a position on a low rise behind the main line, made the decision that would define him either as a coward or a realist, depending on who wrote the history. He began to consolidate. He pulled his scattered forces back from the forward positions in the pines, concentrated them into a more cohesive defensive line, and sent urgent riders east and south toward the approaches to Dazaifu, calling for any reinforcement that could be found. There was none coming, not in time. Phase 4, the push to Dazaifu. By late afternoon, the Mongol advance had reached the approaches to the broad plain that led toward Dazaifu, the administrative heart of Kyushu, the prize behind the prize, the place whose capture would signal the effective conquest of Japan's southernmost main island. This was the moment of maximum danger. The Japanese forces had been compressed, battered, and driven back from their initial positions. Many of the mounted warriors had lost horses, either killed by Mongol arrows or panicked into uselessness by gunpowder explosions. The foot soldiers, many of them lightly armed retainers rather than full samurai, were exhausted from hours of close fighting in difficult terrain. The commanders had lost the ability to communicate clearly across the scattered positions, but they had not broken. In the chronicles and the poems written afterward, this hour, the last light of that November afternoon, is where the Japanese sources locate the emotional center of the battle. Because here, in the dying light, something unexpected happened. Not a tactical reversal, not a brilliant maneuver. Something harder to define and more important. The samurai simply refused to run. Otomo Yoriyasu, commanding the forces to the west of the Japanese line, found his contingent surrounded on three sides by a forward Mongol column that had pushed through a gap in the defensive line. The logical response, the militarily rational response, was to withdraw before the encirclement closed completely. But Otomo did not come from a tradition that prized military rationality above all else. He came from a tradition that prized the quality of the choice made when the rational option was unacceptable. He charged, straight at the forward element of the encircling column, with whatever mounted warriors he had left, at a pace that turned the charge into something almost suicidal. The Mongol formation had not fully consolidated after its advance, and the sudden, violent impact of a samurai charge at close range, not a probe, not a demonstration, but a full-blooded, screaming, everything left charge, disrupted it long enough for the encirclement to fail. Otomo lost half his remaining men in those few minutes. But the line held. These moments, repeated in different forms across the scattered positions of that afternoon, were not enough to turn the battle. The Mongols were not broken. They had not been defeated. They had suffered casualties certainly, more than they had perhaps expected against an opponent they had been briefed would be disorganized and individualistic. But they held the beach. They held the coastal plain. They were advancing. And then the sky changed. Phase 5. The storm. The autumn storms of the Korea Strait are not subtle. They do not build gradually through days of warning clouds and freshening wind. They erupt, sudden, violent, total, in ways that the modern world, with satellite forecasting and weather modeling, can predict but not tame. In 1274 there was no prediction. There was only the smell of the air shifting, the color of the western sky turning a particular shade of greenish-black that the Korean sailors aboard the Mongol fleet recognized with something between professional respect and genuine terror. They had seen that sky before. The storm hit Hakata Bay approximately at dusk on the 19th of November, 1274. The precise sequence of events is disputed. Japanese accounts, written decades and centuries later, have an obvious interest in emphasizing the divine nature of the storm, while modern historians have argued about the exact timing of the Mongol withdrawal relative to the onset of the weather. But the core facts are not in serious dispute. A major typhoon-class storm struck the Mongol fleet at anchor in Hakata Bay that night, and the consequences were catastrophic. The Korean sailors had begun warning the commanders hours earlier. They understood, better than the Mongol generals who had spent their lives on the steppe, what Tat Sky meant. And they understood that 900 ships at anchor in an exposed bay, with a rocky shore to the east and shoaling waters to the north, were 900 ships facing potential destruction. The argument aboard the command vessels, between the generals who did not want to abandon the ground they had won at such cost, and the sailors who knew what was coming, was apparently fierce. We have no record of exactly what was said. We know what was decided. The fleet would withdraw from shore. The exact sequence Whether the storm prompted the withdrawal or whether the withdrawal was already underway for tactical reasons when the storm struck, has been debated by historians for generations. What is certain is that somewhere in the darkness of that November night, with the wind rising to a roar and the bay churning white under a sky that offered no stars, a significant portion of the Mongol fleet was caught. Ships dragged their anchors. Ships collided with each other in the darkness. Ships were driven onto the rocky shore of Shikanoshima Island. Ships capsized. The numbers in the Japanese sources are almost certainly exaggerated for obvious reasons. But the Korean chronicles, written from a perspective that had no stake in inflating Japanese divine favor, record losses of approximately 13,000 soldiers and sailors, nearly half the invasion force drowned or killed in the storm. On the shore, the samurai who had survived the day's fighting heard the storm. They heard the screaming of the wind, and somewhere in it, the sound of wood breaking and men dying in the water. They could not see what was happening. They could only wait. When dawn came on the 20th of November, the bay was empty. The fleet was gone. The ships that had survived, roughly half the armada, had retreated to open water, then back toward Korea. The beach where 30,000 soldiers had landed 24 hours earlier was littered with the debris of an army in flight, abandoned weapons and supplies, the bodies of soldiers who had not made it back to the boats in time, the wreckage of landing craft smashed against the shore by the storm's surge. The samurai walked out of the tree line and onto the beach. They had not won. Not in any tactical sense. They had been driven back from every position they had held. They had lost hundreds of warriors, including men whose names would never appear in any chronicle because they were too low-ranking to merit recording. They had watched their entire tactical doctrine, the doctrine built on individual challenge, honorable announcement, and glorious single combat, fail against an enemy to whom none of it meant anything. But they were still there, and the Mongols were not. The morning after is always the truest accounting. Japanese records suggest samurai casualties in the range of several hundred killed and many more wounded, numbers that sound modest against the scale of the engagement, until you remember that Japan's total defensive force at Hakata that day numbered perhaps 8,000 to 10,000, and that the dead included a significant proportion of the mounted warriors who were the hardest to replace. Among the fallen were several named warriors whose deaths were recorded because their clans had reason to document them in the official claim petitions that began arriving at the Kamakura shogunate almost immediately after the battle, each lord presenting his service and his losses in hopes of reward. The Mongol losses on the beach, those killed in the fighting before the withdrawal, are recorded more ambiguously. Modern historians estimate somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 killed in the land fighting, with the catastrophic remainder of the total losses attributable to the storm. The Korean chronicles, which are the least self-serving source on the invasion's casualties, record that approximately 13,500 men were lost, drowned, shipwrecked, or otherwise killed in the storm's aftermath. Some of those men were found washed ashore on the beaches of northern Kyushu in the days that followed, still in armor, dead of drowning or exposure, separated by their death from any context that could identify them to the people who found them. The beach at Hakata, in the days after the storm cleared, was a strange and terrible landscape. The pine trees at the dune line were festooned with debris, cloth, rope, fragments of oar and hull that the storm had deposited as it withdrew. The waterline was thick with the evidence of the fleet's catastrophe: wooden planking, personal equipment, the swollen bodies of drowned men rolling gently in the surf. Crows and gulls had found the beach before the cleanup parties arrived. The smell reached the nearest farmhouses before dawn. Among the dead washed ashore, and the living prisoners taken in the days after the withdrawal, when Japanese warriors ranging the beaches captured survivors who had not made it back to the ships, were men from 3 different armies. The Mongols, identifiable by their distinctive lamellar armor and composite bows. The Chinese, whose equipment and clothing were different in recognizable ways. And the Koreans, whose presence here was involuntary, and whose faces, contemporary Japanese sources note, showed something beyond the ordinary blankness of enemy dead. They looked, some accounts say, like men who had known all along they were going somewhere they should not have been sent. Holden, the Mongol general, survived. Liu Fuyuan survived. Kim Bang-gyong survived. All 3 would return to Kublai Khan's court to report the failure. A conversation that must have been conducted with extreme care, given the Khan's reputation for responding to failure. The explanation they offered, and which Kublai apparently accepted, was essentially true. The storm had destroyed the operation at the moment of its potential success, and another attempt, properly prepared, would succeed where this one had failed. It was not entirely wrong. The land battle had been going in the Mongols' favor when the weather intervened. The Japanese had been retreating. Another day, perhaps 2, might have seen the fall of Dazaifu. But another day did not come, not then. In Kamakura, where the Hojo regent Tokimune received the reports from Kyushu, the response was complex and revealing. There was relief, certainly. The invaders had gone. There was official piety. The storm was recognized immediately as a divine intervention. The god of the Hakozaki shrine and Hachiman and all the other deities to whom prayers had been offered now receiving their due credit. The priests who had been praying were rewarded. The shrines were rebuilt and expanded. But Tokimune was not a fool, and neither were the men around him. They understood that what had saved Japan was weather, not tactics. The samurai had fought with extraordinary courage and had achieved essentially nothing with it. The Mongols had been winning when they left. The defensive wall along Hakata Bay, the Genko Borui, a stone barrier running for 12 miles along the shoreline at a height of roughly 5 to 7 feet, was ordered into construction almost immediately. The logistics were coordinated across all the Kyushu warrior clans, who provided labor parties alongside their regular military obligations. The wall took years to complete, and it was finished in time for what everyone knew was coming. Kublai Khan sent new ambassadors too to Japan in 1275 and again in 1279. Tokimune had them both executed. The wall kept rising. The next fleet was already being planned. The second Mongol invasion of Japan came in the summer of 1281, and it was 3 times the size of the first. 140,000 soldiers, 4,400 ships. 2 separate fleets coordinated to strike simultaneously, one from Korea, one from the ports of southern China, where the Yuan fleet had been building for years. If 1274 had been a probe, 1281 was a hammer. But the Genko Borui stopped the landing at Hakata. The stone wall that the samurai and their conscripted labor had built across those intervening 7 years did precisely what it was designed to do. It prevented the invaders from establishing a beachhead. The Mongol fleet was forced to anchor in the bay for weeks while the commanders argued about where to go. The samurai raided the fleet at night in small boats, boarding individual vessels, killing crew and soldiers, then withdrawing before reinforcements could respond. It was guerrilla warfare on water, and it was effective enough to keep the invasion stalled. Then the storm came again. A typhoon of extraordinary power struck Kyushu in August of 1281 and obliterated the Mongol fleet. This time, the losses were not 13,000. Estimates range from 60,000 to 100,000 dead. Drowned, shipwrecked, killed on the beaches when their ships broke apart and drove them onto the shore where waiting samurai waited with swords. But the greatest empire the world had ever seen did not die in the storm. It survived. It simply stopped looking at Japan. Kublai Khan never tried again. He died in 1294, still nominally planning a third invasion that was never organized. The Yuan dynasty survived another 7 decades before collapsing under Chinese rebellion. Japan was never conquered by the Mongols. The 2 storms that saved Japan were called Kamikaze, divine winds, and the name entered the Japanese language and culture at a depth that went far beyond a meteorological event. Here was proof, if the nation needed proof, that Japan was protected, that the gods intervened on Japan's behalf, that the islands were not merely a nation, but something set apart, sacred, inviolable, chosen. This belief would shape Japanese foreign policy and self-concept for centuries, contributing to the isolationism of the Edo period and, much later, to the spiritual framework that produced the Second World War's suicide pilots, who took the same name for themselves, believing as they flew their final missions that they were continuing what the storms had begun, that Japan's protection was guaranteed by sacrifice as much as by weather. The Battle of 1274 also changed Japanese warfare itself, though the process was slower and more painful than a simple lesson absorbed. The samurai system did not immediately abandon its individual combat ethos. That ethos was too deeply cultural, too tied to identity and religion and aesthetics, to simply be replaced by tactical reading. But the shock of Hakata seeded a slow evolution. Over the following generations, Japanese armies began to develop greater appreciation for coordinated infantry tactics, for unit discipline, for the kind of formations that had proven so effective against the individual samurai charge. By the time the Warring States period of the 15th and 16th centuries arrived, Japanese armies looked considerably less like the forces that had ridden down to the beach at Hakata, and considerably more like the kinds of armies that had stepped off the landing craft. History is a long teacher, and it charges high tuition. The political consequences were immediate and transformative. Tokimune, the regent who had refused to kneel before the Khan and had ordered the ambassadors executed, became a figure of legendary stature. His gamble had paid off, not because of his tactical planning, which had been inadequate to the actual threat, but because weather and warrior stubbornness and 7 years of wall building had filled the gaps his strategy left. He took Buddhist vows in 1284 and died that same year, barely 33 years old, having presided over the moment that defined his nation. The Hojo Regency continued for another 4 decades before collapsing in the upheaval of the 1330s, ironically destroyed not by foreign invasion, but by Japanese rebellion. But the name Tokimune endured. It still does. The samurai who fought at Hakata received rewards that were, by their own account, deeply insufficient. The normal system for compensating warriors, grants of enemy land, redistribution of conquered territory, had no mechanism for rewarding men who defended territory that was never lost and captured no new ground. The samurai of Kyushu filed petitions for years demanding recognition and payment. Many received nothing. But their service had been real, and they knew it, and the bitterness of unrewarded sacrifice calcified over years into a structural grievance that would eventually help bring down the very regime they had died protecting. This was not irony. This was the ordinary arithmetic of how warrior aristocracies consume themselves from within when they have no external enemy left to fight. Takazaki Suenaga, the samurai whose painted scroll survived and became one of the most important primary sources on the invasion, spent years pursuing his reward claims through the Kamakura bureaucracy before finally receiving recognition. His scroll, the Moko Shurai Ekotoba, the illustrated account of the Mongol invasion, is both a military document and a petition, a piece of evidence assembled to prove that he had done something worth compensating. Because of it, we can see the battle in a way that almost no medieval engagement allows. Through the eyes of a man who was there, who watched the bombs fall and the horses panic and the formations advance, who fought 3 charges and somehow lived. Centuries later, the beach at Hakata is a park. There are walking paths along the shore where the landing craft came in, and plaques explaining what happened here, and a reconstruction of the Genko Borui wall that was rediscovered in the 20th century, buried under centuries of sedimentation. Tourists walk along the waterline in the autumn evenings, watching the light go copper and gray over the bay, and in the distance, Shikanoshima Island sits where it has always sat, unchanged on the horizon. The water, where 13,000 soldiers drowned in a single night, is very quiet now. But those who know what happened here, who understand what those 900 ships meant and what it cost to turn them back, hear something else in that quiet. Something the wind carries in off the Korea Strait on November evenings, when the sky turns the particular shade of greenish black that a Korean sailor would recognize, and the waves come in gray and cold. The gods, if they were listening then, have been listening ever since.
Charge